Hello and welcome to Topic 3, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be defining crime. So Chapter 2 that you'll be reading for Topic 3 this week covers a lot of material. We will be looking at defining crime, categories of crime, crime trends, tools to measure crime, and crime patterns. Now, in this lecture, we're going to be defining crimes and talking about the different categories of crimes. And in the next lecture, we're going to be talking about the tools that are used to measure crime as well as crime perceptions. You'll be responsible for reading in your textbook about crime trends and crime patterns, and make sure that you read the chapter and all of it. Don't just depend on the lecture when you're taking your reading quiz for Topic 3. There are also a couple of articles you should be reading this week as well, and there will be questions on the reading quiz regarding those articles. So let's go ahead and get started. So how is crime defined? Initially, it seems sort of simple. A crime is a behavior that is prohibited because it causes great harm to society. When you live in a society, you want to keep people safe. And so if behaviors harm people, if they cause disorder and great disruption, then you're probably going to want to prohibit those behaviors and call those behaviors crimes. But when you look around at behaviors within our society, you might look at some behaviors that don't really bring up a lot of harm to society, yet they're defined as crime. But you might see other behaviors that actually bring a lot of harm to society, but aren't considered criminal. So why are some low harm acts considered crimes when higher harm acts are not considered crimes? So let's take a look first at some low or no harm behaviors that are considered crimes. These are oftentimes referred to as victimless crimes. And some examples of victimless crimes are prostitution, assisted suicide, some forms of gambling. So in most states throughout the United States, if you sell a sex act, you've engaged in a criminal behavior. If you help somebody commit suicide, in most states, that's illegal. It's a crime. And even in some states, some forms of gambling are criminal. And so, but you might be asking yourself, well, what's the harm that comes from this, right? In prostitution, it's two consenting adults who are exchanging a service for money. Assisted suicide, who's the victim there? Somebody who wanted to commit suicide but was physically unable to, depends on somebody else. Who's the victim there? And you could sort of say the same thing about gambling, right? That it is a person gets a lot of enjoyment out of gambling. Another entity either makes or loses money. Why is that a harmful behavior? And yet, those kinds of behaviors are classified as crimes throughout the United States. On the flip side of that, you could see some high harm behaviors that are not crimes, not classified as crimes. Here's two examples. You could say, excessive carbon emission is really harmful to our society, and not just to our society, but to the world, right? Because we're having carbon emissions relate to changes in climate, and changes in climate oftentimes lead to increased hurricanes, wildfires, a whole host of problems, rising ocean rates, etc. So there's a behavior that has clearly a victim, clearly harmful, but it's not criminal to emit carbon into the atmosphere. Another example is the mortgage selling practices. So if you've ever watched The Big Short, if you're familiar with the economic collapse of 2008, where basically our economy was brought to its knees, in large part because of some selling practices where mortgages that were worthless were bundled together and they were sold, they were traded. And because so many people bought and traded in those worthless mortgages, that basically it had great harm on our economic system, leading to mass unemployment and other problems. Yet, those mortgage selling practices are not illegal, and in fact, some are still engaging in those practices today. So how do we make sense of this? How do we make sense that some no harm behavior is considered a crime, it's classified as a crime, but high harm behaviors are not considered crime? Well, the perspectives that we're going to take a look at that help us understand different theories of how behaviors are classified as crime are going to help us make sense of this. So let's take a look at those different theories. Your textbook offers 3 different theories of why behavior is classified as a crime. The first one that we're going to learn about is the consensus theory. The second is conflict theory, and the third is interactionist. So let's take a look at each of these in more detail. Okay, let's start with the consensus view. So the consensus view says that criminal law is rules set by state authorities, like state legislatures or the federal legislature, that express the norms, values, and goals of the vast majority of people in that society. In other words, there is a consensus regarding what behaviors are harmful. From this perspective, they view criminal law as social control, and that therefore criminal law is controlling those behaviors that are likely to harm society and where most people feel that these behaviors do harm society. So the behaviors that are widely accepted as harmful are criminalized, such as homicide, assault, robbery, forcible rape. Nobody's going to disagree that those kinds of actions don't cause harm. But they would also say that, and even if a behavior is not regarded as overtly harmful, the majority feel that that behavior causes a type of harm that justifies criminalization. So, for example, you could say, well, who's the victim in prostitution? Well, from the consensus view, you would say that prostitution is harmful, that it harms our morality, and most people agree with that, and most people think that it's potentially harmful in terms of that it could prey on vulnerable women, or could also lead to predatory behavior towards children as well, or sex trafficking. Okay, so the consensus view, bottom line is the majority of people think that this kind of behavior is harmful, whether it's harmful in terms of physical harm or harmful in terms of other types of societal harm. The next theory we're going to look at is the consensus view. And from this perspective, they argue that behaviors are defined as criminal not because the majority of people feel that they're harmful, but that rather that criminal law and what behaviors that are deemed crimes are a reflection of class structure. So from their perspective, they say that those who have economic power are those who are most likely going to have the power to make laws. And so the more wealthy you are, the more likely you are to hold elected office. The less wealthy you are, the less likely you are to hold elected office. So those who have economic power are the ones who are making decisions about what is considered criminal. They go a step further and they say that the laws that the wealthy make are that they make laws that criminalize the behaviors that jeopardize their hold on economic power. Okay? So people who have economic power want to criminalize behaviors that jeopardize their position on economic power. So what are some examples that this conflict view might use to support this claim? And so one of the examples that they use is the war on drugs. And so the thinking is that those with less economic power benefit from selling marijuana, but those with more economic power benefit from selling legal drugs such as tobacco and alcohol. And so the thinking is that if you were to legalize marijuana, again, this is from the conflict view, then people would turn to, buying marijuana, and it may reduce the profits associated with buying alcohol and smoking tobacco, right? And so those with economic power, the war on drugs is a way of keeping those who are economically disadvantaged from making money off of drugs, but keeping those who have strong holds on power and economically benefit from certain legal drugs such as alcohol and tobacco, that they have the power in order to keep certain drugs criminalized. Another example that they might point to is the saying that theft, so the theft of private property versus the theft of public revenue. So from this perspective, they say that criminal law punishes harshly individuals who steal other people's private property, right? And so if you burglarize somebody's house and steal their things, or you steal their car or whatever, of course you want to crack down on those people because those people are taking a person's private property. However, there's other kinds of theft from this perspective that where people that theft that's not criminalized at all. So the example that they might point to is the legal tax avoidance strategies that people use to not pay taxes. And they view that as basically a theft of public revenue. And that's legal. It's legal to, put your finances in an offshore holding account, and you wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. There's also like all these legal games that you can play to like hide your revenue, but in a legal manner so that you don't have to pay your full taxes. And people from this perspective would say, well, that's a way of keeping the public poor because people aren't paying their fair share in terms of public revenue, and that public revenue could be used to increase the livelihoods of those who are in more economic straits. And so they look at that and say, okay, well, you want to crack down on theft of private property because people who are wealthy have a lot of private property, and they don't want that private property to be taken away. But that people who have economic power don't seem to give as much care about the theft of public revenue, and in fact, they might benefit from having those tax avoidance strategies remain legal. And then a final example, would be, how we talked about earlier about keeping those harmful mortgage practices that bundle, worthless mortgages, but then you can sell them and buy them and make a bunch of money off of them. It seems like those should be illegal practices, but those with economic power really benefit from not making those practices illegal. And thus, since those with economic power criminalize certain behaviors, they're not going to criminalize this behavior because they're getting an economic benefit from it. Okay, so that in a nutshell is the conflict view. Okay, the last perspective we're going to take a look at is the interactionist viewpoint. From this perspective, they say that criminal law is a reflection of the values, opinions, and preferences of those in power. What they argue is that those who have power to define behaviors as crimes impose their own values and their own moral codes on the rest of the population. From this perspective, they see those who have power as oftentimes lawmakers as these moral entrepreneurs. That a moral entrepreneur is a group of people, relatively smaller group of people, that try to persuade the rest of society to enforce rules that are consistent with their own moral beliefs, with the group's moral beliefs. And so from this perspective, the reason that some behaviors are defined as crime is a reflection not of the harm that they do to society, but rather a reflection of the lawmakers' moral values. So criminal law is a reflection of the morals of those in power, not those things that are inherently evil or harmful. Some examples, of course, prostitution versus sex workers. The reason why prostitution remains a crime is because those in power think that prostitution is immoral, right? And so therefore, that's why they keep that behavior as defined as a crime, not because it's harmful, but that because it's immoral. Assisted suicide, another good example, right? That from this, the people in power, their morals are that suicide is wrong, taking another person's life, even if you're helping them end their life, participating in their suicide, that's morally wrong, and therefore it should be criminalized. Okay, so get you sort of thinking critically about these three views. Just ask yourself, and a question like this might come up on the midterm exam, of the three different views that we just learned about, which view do you think seems to do the best job of explaining how behaviors get defined as criminal in the United States? And just as we did with the justice perspectives we just learned about, crime control, rehabilitationist, etc., probably no one of these views is a perfect sort of answer to, how behaviors are defined as crime. There's probably some behaviors that are defined as crime that are best explained by the interactionist perspective. Other behaviors that are defined as criminal might be better explained through the consensus view, etc. So it's very possible that all three combined help us get a broad and robust understanding of why behaviors are defined as crimes. Okay, so let's learn about categories of crime. It's important to learn about categories of crime because when we learn about the tools used to measure crime, they oftentimes refer specifically to different categories of crime. violent crime, property crime, etc. So let's look at these different categories so that when you're learning about the tools used to measure crime, you'll get a better sense of what they're talking about when they're talking about categories. So one category of crime is violent crime. And the Uniform Crime Reporting Tool defines violent crime as 4 offenses: murder or non-negligent manslaughter. And so non-negligent manslaughter would be where you intended to kill somebody, you're responsible for their death, and you did it in a way that was non-negligent, that it basically sort of intended to do it. Forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault. Okay, so when the Uniform Crime Report says that we see an increase or a decrease in violent crime, those are the crimes that they're talking about. Now, your textbook talks about the difference between expressive violent crimes and instrumental violent crimes. Expressive violent crimes are violent crimes that are a product of emotional rage, right? You assault somebody because you're really angry at them. You murder somebody because you're really angry at them. And those would be examples of expressive violent crime. Instrumental violent crime, or where people engage in a violent act, a violent crime, because they're either seeking economic advancement or some sort of social advancement. And so robbery, that is where you forcibly take something from somebody, right? You're walking down the street, somebody pulls a gun on you and says, give me your phone and your wallet, right? That would be armed robbery. You might do that because you're angry at somebody, expressive crime. But you could also or only do that because you're poor and you need the money, right? And it's a source of economic advancement. You could also engage in a violent crime because you think you're going to get a social benefit from it, as some sort of social advancement. So if you're a member of a gang and they say, we want you to assault somebody or rob somebody to prove that you are worthy of joining that gang, you might engage in a violent crime in order to prove that your social worth. And therefore, by engaging in that violent crime, you would get some sort of social advancement, entry into the gang. Now, another a category of crime is what is known as property crime. And so the UCR defines property crime as burglary. That would be entering into somebody's home or business without their approval and stealing their stuff. Larceny or theft, and larceny is the theft of personal property. Theft would be the stealing of things that don't include entering into some sort of like home or business. Motor vehicle theft, arson, all of those are considered property crimes. Now, keep in mind that we hear a lot more about violent crimes than we hear about property crimes, but many more property crimes are committed in the United States than violent crimes. Okay, so let's look at the last categories of crime that your textbook talks about. The first one is public order crimes. And these are behaviors that are illegal because they run against the morality of that society. So sort of a good example of the interactionist viewpoint in these public order crimes. And so public order crimes would be like prostitution, but it could also be like public drunkenness. It could be public nudity, lewd behavior. All of those fall in the category of public order crimes. Economic crimes are non-violent acts where the principal motive for that act is economic gain. And so tax evasion, insider trading, cyber crimes, identity theft, all of those are good examples of economic crimes. And then the final thing I want to point out is the concept of the FBI Part 1 crimes. Okay, so you'll also hear that referenced in the Uniform Crime Report. The Uniform Crime Report is put out by the FBI. And so that Part 1 crimes are the violent crimes of murder, non-negligent manslaughter, forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, violent crimes. But they also include the property crimes of burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. So if you hear the reference to increase in Part 1 crimes, that is what they're referring to. Okay, thanks. And when we get together on the next lecture, we're going to be talking about the tools that help us measure crime. Talk to you soon.